Tonight, I have the opportunity of sharing with you how astronomy and physics brought me to faith in Jesus Christ 8 years before I got to know a Christian. And if you go to our book table, you'll see cards that are similar to this. And if you fill that out, we're actually going to give you a free DVD where I share in much more detail than I have tonight how physics and astronomy brought me to faith in Jesus Christ. It also features me fielding questions from skeptics. So that's a free gift for you this evening. But my story is that I was raised in Canada. I grew up in British Columbia, a really beautiful place, but Christians are hard to find in Canada. I didn't really get to know a Christian, at least to get to know a Christian well, until I was 27 years of age. And that's happened when I arrived on the Caltech campus. Caltech is loaded with believers. So that's really where I had my first exposure to Christians. However, I did get to meet some stars and galaxies when I was 7 years of age. And that happened because I was walking with my parents in the evening and said, "Mom, Dad, are those stars hot?" They said, "Yes, the stars are hot." I said, "Please tell me why they're hot." And they said, "You got to go to the library," which is exactly what I did. And I came home with 5 books on physics and astronomy, and I did that every week. Every week I would go to the public library and bring home these books. And ever since I was 7 years of age, I have been deeply fascinated by the universe of galaxies, stars, and the planets. And by the time I was 8 years of age, I knew that my future career would lie in astrophysics. And that's what led me to make some unexpected discoveries, because what happened from the age of 8 onwards is I would pick a particular subdiscipline of astronomy and give that an in-depth study. So one year I looked at stellar interiors, another year at the atmospheres of stars and the structure of galaxies. And when I was 16, I devoted a year to studying cosmology. Now that's not the same as cosmetology. There really is a difference. Cosmology is the science of the origin and history of the universe. And that was a time when there was a lot of debate going on. Is it a steady state universe? Is it an oscillating universe? Is it a Big Bang universe? And there were 2 or 3 other theories. But at that time, the evidence was heavily favoring that it was indeed a Big Bang universe. And if it's Big Bang, that means there's a beginning. And there's a beginning, there must be a beginner. And so starting in age 17, I went on a quest to find the beginner of the universe. And I first looked for that beginner in the writings of Immanuel Kant, because he's the father of modern cosmology. And he writes about God. But what he wrote in his Critique of Pure Reason is that space and time have existed for eternity. And I knew that was incorrect. Space and time didn't exist until the universe came into existence. And he had other ideas that were not fitting what I knew to be true about astronomy. I went to Descartes, I went to a few other philosophers, and finally I gave up on these philosophers and began to look at the holy books of the religions of the world. And I began with Hinduism and the Hindu Vedas. But I discovered in Hinduism, they teach that we live in a reincarnating universe, a universe that goes through endless cycles of rebirths, where the universe is born, it dies, it's reborn, it dies again, but with a cycle of 4.32 billion years. And I knew that number was not correct. I also knew that the universe had an entropy measure that was 100 million times too high to permit the possibility of a rebirth of the universe. And so I put Hinduism aside. Now, the high school I went to in Vancouver was predominantly Asian. We had a lot of Buddhists, and so they encouraged me to look at the Buddhist commentaries. I discovered that Buddhism teaches the same cosmology as Hinduism. And we had a couple of students in our high school that were Muslims. I looked at the Quran, and I noted that the creation texts in the Quran contradicted one another. One of them implied that the planets were more distant than the stars. And even with the naked eye, we know that that is incorrect. There was a gentleman in our school who was of the Baha'i faith, and he says, he was looking at my studies, and he says, what we do in Baha'i is we take the kernels of truths from all the different religions and we put them together into a consistent package. I says, great, show me what you got. A week later, I went back to him and said, well, from what I can tell, what's happened in Baha'i, they take all the errors of the world's religions and put them together into an inconsistent package. And he said, well, show me what you've got. And he wound up leaving the Baha'i faith. Now, when I told you earlier that I didn't get to know Christians until I was 27 years of age, I actually did see some from a distance when I was growing up. So, for example, when I was 11 years of age, there were two men that came into our public school and put 2 boxes on our teacher's desk and left without saying a single word. But in those boxes were Gideon Bibles. And we're all invited to take one. And every one of us did. My Gideon Bible stayed on my shelf, untouched, unread, for 6 years. And in hindsight, I'm glad I didn't pick it up right away, because the Gideons gave me a foreign language edition that we call the King James translation. But the benefit of a high school education in Canada is starting in grade 7, we would go through 2 of William Shakespeare's plays every year. So by the time I was 17, I was fluent in King James English. And so I picked up this Gideon Bible. And what I noticed in going through that Gideon Bible is it repeatedly said something I didn't see in any other holy book. Everything must be tested. Don't believe until you first put it to the test. But if it passes the test, accept it. As Paul says in Thessalonians, everything is to be tested, but hold fast to that which proves to be true. And I found this repeated throughout the Bible. I didn't see this in any other holy book. But the other thing I noticed about the Bible is that it perfectly followed the scientific method. Now, I hear it's different here in America, but in Canada, we're taught the scientific method in grade 1. We're taught it in grade 2. We're taught it in grade 3. We get it every single year. But none of my public school teachers told me where the scientific method came from. When I picked up my Gideon Bible, every time the Bible spoke about creation, the scientific method leapt off the page. And what I realized is the Bible not only commands objective testing, it tells us step by step how everything is to be put to the test. And what I discovered was it was no accident that the scientific revolution exploded out of Reformation Europe. During the Reformation, people were encouraged to read the Bible for themselves. And those with a scientific bent saw this biblical testing method, they applied it to their science, and that was the birth of the scientific method, and that's what launched the scientific revolution. And I recognized too, at age 17 and 18, science was stillborn in every other culture. It's only in the Christian milieu that it had a chance to be born and to flourish and to continue to explode to this very day. Now, what I'm going to show you in the next few minutes is how this biblical testing method helps us to see that Genesis 1, the very first page of the Bible, is not a scientific embarrassment. If you follow that biblical testing method, everything it states is correct with respect to modern science, and it's all in the correct chronological sequence. I'm going to share that story because that's what motivated me to begin to make a more serious study of the Bible. It literally took me 4.5 hours to get out of the first page of the Bible because I was checking everything out. But at the end of that, I realized this book is different. This is the only book I picked up where it got the creation story accurate in every detail. Now, let me just quickly take you through it, and then I'll tell you what happened later on as I came to that conclusion. First of all, the opening sentence of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. As I was sharing with the men this morning, when I saw that, I said, what are these heavens and earth? And I went through the whole of the Old Testament looking for the word universe. It's not there. What I now understand, in biblical Hebrew, there is no word for universe. there is in Greek, but not in Hebrew. Instead, they have this phrase, the Shamayana Res, the heavens and the earth. So whenever you see the heavens and the earth with a definite article in the Old Testament, you'll see it 9 times every time it refers to the totality of physical reality. Not just all matter and energy, but all space and time. When I got to the New Testament, I actually saw there were places where it says that God was doing things before he created the universe, before he created space and time. In fact, what's interesting is how God begins his works of redeeming humanity to himself before he creates anything. 2 Timothy 1:9, the grace of God that we now experience was put into effect before the beginning of time. Or Titus 1:2, the hope that we share in Jesus Christ was given to us before the beginning of time. And that's what's unique about the Bible. The non-biblical books of the religions of the world teach that space and time are eternal, and that God or gods or cosmic forces create within this eternity of space and time. But the Bible stands alone in saying space and time don't exist until God creates the universe. Now, I was just beginning to enter into a physics program at the University of British Columbia when I saw all this in the Bible. That was the same time that physicists in Britain were developing the first of the space-time theorems. And it was those theorems that launched Stephen Hawking to worldwide fame. He was one of the 2 authors on the first of those space-time theorems. In fact, I'm going to show you that theorem right now. I actually got the paper. If you love tensor calculus, you can actually peruse that. But for those of you who are not into tensor calculus, this is the bottom line of the space-time theorem. It basically says space and time are created if 2 conditions are true. Condition number 1, the universe contains mass. Each one of you is living proof that the universe contains mass. I won't point my finger, but some of you are a little more so than others. Okay. Condition number 2, the equations of general relativity reliably describe the movements of bodies in the universe. Now, when I was 17, that was only proven to 1% precision. Today, it's proven to 15 places of the decimal. Today, general relativity ranks as the most exhaustively tested and best proven principle in all of physics. There's nothing we're more certain of in physics than the reliability of general relativity. But what this theorem is saying, if general relativity is reliable and if the universe contains mass, then space and time must have a beginning. Space and time must be created, which implies there must be a being beyond space and time that created our universe of matter, energy, space, and time. So here I was 17 years of age realizing that it's the God of the Bible that has now been proven by physics to be responsible for the universe. Just looking at Genesis 1:1, we can establish it's not the God of Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or Baha'i, it's the God of the Bible that created the universe. See how rich the opening sentence of the Bible is? Okay. A miracle-working God must exist. For those of you who want to dig into this in a little more detail, this book is written for lay people, why the universe is the way it is. It's out there. But I'll tell you the primary reason I wrote this book. It's basically making the point that not only is the physics of the universe and the laws of physics optimally designed to make possible our existence, it's simultaneously optimally designed to be a tool in God's hand to permanently eliminate evil. And then once evil is gone, God's going to replace this universe with a brand new realm with radically different physics. We're not going to need gravity in the new creation because there won't be evil. We won't need thermodynamics because there won't be evil anymore. And gravity no longer is going to cause your chin to sag as you get older and older. That's not going to happen. And thermodynamics is not going to cause your body to decay. As it says in Revelation 21, no decay, no death, no electromagnetism, no gravity, because evil will no longer exist. So that's what's in why the universe is the way it is. But what I'm going to take you through the rest of my time here is basically the 4 next steps that were critical in my realizing that the Bible is the inspired, inerrant Word of God. Now, step 1 of the biblical testing method: do not interpret until you establish the frame of reference or the point of view. So I was explaining to the men this morning, the reason why most scientists think Genesis teaches scientific nonsense, they fail to follow that first step. Don't interpret until you establish the frame of reference. Now, the frame of reference for Genesis 1:1 is the universe, but Genesis 1:2 changes that frame of reference from the universe to the surface of the earth. That makes all the difference in transforming Genesis 1 from scientific nonsense to being one of the best evidences that we have that the Bible is scientifically accurate in everything that it declares. It's at the surface of the waters of planet Earth, below the cloud layer, not above the cloud layer. That's the frame of reference for the 6 days. So the observer is looking up, not down on the clouds. Now, the reason that makes a difference is what you see in the initial conditions. Step 2 of the biblical testing method: do not interpret until you also establish the starting conditions. And you see that Genesis 1:2 does both. It gives you the frame of reference and the initial conditions. And what does it tell us about the primordial earth? It's dark on the surface of the waters. The water covers the whole surface of the earth. And the earth is empty of life and it's unfit for life, but now God begins to perform his creation miracles. Now, there are 3 other texts in the Bible that take you through the 6 days of creation: Job 37, 38, and 39, Psalm 104, and Proverbs 8. And I think you're aware of just how much Christians fight over creation doctrine. But the reason for all that fighting, they don't integrate what the Bible's got to say. It's not one book, it's 66 books. The reason why God gave us 66 books and not one book is so we can use the 65 to test what's in the one. God wants us to integrate across the Bible. It's not enough to take the Bible literally, we have to take it literally and consistently. And so just looking at those 4 texts, one's in Job, Psalms, and Proverbs, helps us to understand what Moses is communicating in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. And to give you an example of that, when you go to Job 38, it tells us why it was dark on the surface of the waters. It wasn't dark because there was no sun. It was dark because God had blanketed the oceans with clouds that kept the light of the sun out. So here it's explicit as to why it's dark. When did the sun exist? Well, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That would include stars and galaxies. So the stars were there from the beginning. But as you'll see, they don't become visible to an observer on the surface of the earth until the 4th day. But what happens on creation day 1? Well, let me cover this first, because this is the most important point. If you remember nothing else from what you hear tonight, I want you to remember this. The frame of reference is the surface of the waters underneath the cloud layer. That makes all the difference in how we interpret Genesis 1. If you can remember 2 things, I think some of you are capable of remembering 2 things. Okay, the second thing is to recognize that this word yom that's translated as day has 4 distinct definitions, which, by the way, is true of virtually every Hebrew noun. The word earth that you see in Genesis 1 has 5 distinct literal definitions. Hebrew, after all, has a very small vocabulary size. So this word yom has 4 distinct definitions that you'll see in every lexicon. Part of the daylight hours, like from noon to 3 p.m., all of the daylight hours, a 24-hour period, and a long but finite period of time. Now, at age 17, I realized that I had to have at least 3 of these definitions, because 3 show up even in the English translation. So in creation day 1, the text contrasts days and nights. That's the word day for the daylight hours. On creation day 4, it contrasts seasons, days, and years. That's day for 24 hours, and Genesis 2:4 uses the word day to refer to the entirety of creation history. That's day as a long period of time. As I was explaining to the men at breakfast this morning, right away I concluded that it must be 6 consecutive long periods of time. Why? Because you've got an evening and a morning for the first 6 days. And whatever that means in the original language, I knew it meant that each day had a distinct start point and a distinct end point. And you see that for the first 6 creation days. But when you go to the 7th day, there's no evening and morning. It's not there. Nowhere in the Bible do we see the 7th day closed out. Matter of fact, you see 3 texts, Psalm 95, John 5, and Hebrews 4, that tell us that right now we're in God's 7th day. There's an 8th day coming when God will create again, Revelation 21 and 22. But right now we're in that time period where God rests from his work of creation. Now let me give you a little bit of a backstory. I told you earlier that starting at age 7, I was coming home from the library with 5 books on physics and astronomy. And by the time I got to be 11, my parents thought I was being obsessive about physics and astronomy, and they wanted to broaden me a little bit. And so they sacrificed what little money they had and got the family a big, thick book on evolutionary biology. They wanted me to actually study something that wasn't physics and astronomy. Well, I was the only one in the family that read the book. I remember going to my parents and saying, "Mom, Dad, the numbers don't add up. This book documents all the speciation before humanity, and there's hardly any afterwards. Can you explain to me the reason?" They said, "No, go ask your science teachers." My science teacher said, "Go ask the professors at the university." And they basically had no answer. 17 years of age, I open up the Bible, and it says, "For 6 days God creates. On the 7th day, he stops creating." I said, that answers the fossil record enigma. The reason why we see it for these periods before humanity, that's when God is actively, supernaturally intervening to create new species of life. The reason we don't see it today, God is resting from his work of performing physical miracles. On the other hand, he's very active on the spiritual side. This is God's Sabbath, his day of rest. And so seeing that was a huge light bulb experience for me, that God's rest answers the fossil record enigma. Hey, if you want to read more about these creation days, I've got a whole book on it, A Matter of Days. I did see that it's out at the table there. But let me now take you through the 6 days of creation, because this was the most important part in persuading me that the Bible was the inspired, inerrant Word of God. Creation day 1, let there be light. And when I realized at age 17, I was expecting it to say that God created the light. It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that God made the light. It says, let the light be. Well, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's matter, energy, space, and time. And so when God created the universe was filled with light, but it was dark on the surface of the earth because of the cloud layer. So what happened on creation day 1 was that God transformed the atmosphere from being opaque to being translucent, where light could now pass through and photosynthesis can begin. As I understand, Genesis is teaching us that the origin of the first life was the beginning of creation day 1. Light coming through would permit that life to thrive on the surface of the earth. And as an astronomer, I can tell you that indeed the primordial earth would have had an opaque atmosphere. The thickness of a planet's atmosphere is proportional to its mass and is proportional to how far away it is from its star. Venus has an atmosphere more than 40 times thicker than the Earth today. We know that Earth began with an atmosphere that's about 120 to 150 times thicker than it is today. An atmosphere that thick will not let light pass through. So the miracle of creation day 1 is God transforming our planet from a very thick atmosphere to a very thin one. And I've actually written a book on how that miracle was achieved. And the chances of that happening by a natural means without God's supernatural intervention, far more remote than one chance in a trillion had a few more trillions. This is a miracle that we have this big planet with a thin atmosphere. Then creation day 2, it says, let there be water above and water below. Now that's all it says in the text. But Moses could afford to be really brief because Job devotes a chapter and a half to the events of creation day 2. Water above refers to the water vapor where the clouds form, and liquid water in the oceans below. When you go to Job 37 and Job 38, it explains in detail how God set up this amazing water cycle where multiple forms of precipitation fall out of the clouds upon the face of the earth. And these are just 6 of the different kinds of precipitation that are mentioned in the book of Job. Different kinds of liquid precipitation, different kinds of frozen precipitation. But I remember teaching on this in our church, making the point you can find 16 different kinds of precipitation in the book of Job, and we need every one of those to sustain civilization over the face of the globe. And that takes an amazingly designed water cycle to make that. Just to have a water cycle requires a miracle. But to have one that gives all these forms of precipitation so that humans can live over the whole surface of the earth, utterly outstanding. Creation day 2. Now, I don't have time to actually explain to you the miracle of creation day 1 and creation day 2, but we do that in this television documentary, Journey Toward Creation. And it's basically where I take you on a travel journey from the surface of the earth to the very edge of the universe. And in astronomy, the farther away you go, the farther back in time, because it takes time for light to reach us. And so we now have the telescope power that we can image the cosmic creation event. We can actually watch in real time God bringing this universe into existence. Now, whenever I said that, people say, you gotta be exaggerating. We can't get that close to the cosmic beginning. Here's how close we can get. I can show you an image that shows you what the universe was like when it was 1/100 billionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second old. That's how close we can get to the cosmic creation event. And it's our ability to image the cosmic creation event which gives us the most compelling scientific proof that a God beyond space and time must have created the universe. And what I explain in why the universe is the way it is, we humans are living at the only time in cosmic history where we get to see 100% of the history of the universe. We're also living at the only place in this vast universe of 50 billion trillion stars where we get to see the whole story. The Bible says the heavens declare the glory of God, but I find it amazing He put us in the only place and at the only time where we could read the whole book of the heavens declaring the glory of God. He wanted us to read that book. All right. Creation day 3. The formation of the continental land masses. Up until creation day 3, Earth was just one watery ball. The water covered the whole surface of the earth. On creation day 3, God transforms our planet from a water world into a world where you've got oceans and continents coexisting on its surface. A fundamental requirement for plants and animals. If you don't have that, you don't have the nutrient recirculation that's necessary to sustain plants and animals. And notice Genesis doesn't mention plants and animals until after creation day 3, until after we get the continents established. Now, I had the privilege at the University of British Columbia from taking a geophysics course from 2 of the 3 physicists that launched the discipline of plate tectonics. Today, that discipline is so well developed, we can tell you in great detail the growth of the continental land masses upon the face of the earth. In fact, I'm going to show you a little graph right now that gives you the history of the buildup of the continents on the face of the earth. documenting that indeed the Bible got it right when it said that the earth began with no land at all, just oceans. Then we get these small volcanic islands, then plate tectonics kicks in, and the continents begin to build up. But what I want you to notice on that graph is that time period where you see the most aggressive growth of continental land masses. It happens when the earth is a little bit less than half of its current age. Where does Genesis put it? The beginning of creation, day 3. A little bit less than half of the story of the 6 days. So not only does the Bible get the scientific details right, it puts it at precisely the right time in the history of the earth. And once the continents are in place, the text tells us, let the land produce plants. Now, I've debated Michael Shermer, the executive director of the Skeptics Society, 4 times in different university campuses. And we've never debated on Genesis 1. At least that's never been the topic of our debate. But it doesn't matter. Whatever the debate topic, when Michael gets his turn, he spends all of his time bashing Genesis 1. Especially if he knows I don't have time for a rebuttal. He loves to do that. But his big point is Genesis is teaching nonsense because the fossil record tells us the plants don't show up on the continents until after animals show up in the oceans. And Genesis gets the other way around. My response was simply this. Animals have shells and bones. Their fossil remains are going to last a lot longer than the remains of plants. Plants will decay. And so it's not surprising to me we don't have the fossils of the early plants on the continental land masses. But all that has changed because now we have published research papers first documenting isotope evidence that plants were abundant on the continents long before the animals show up. And now we even have fossil evidence. Not complete fossils. The biggest fossil we have is 1 millimeter across. But we got the parts, the fossil parts, showing us that plants were just as abundant on the continents for 600 million years before the appearance of animals that we see in the oceans. So Genesis has now been fully vindicated. As we move into creation day 4, it says, let there be the great lights. This is when the sun, moon, and stars first become visible to creatures on the surface of the earth. They were there before the 6 days, but not until the 4th day does the atmosphere go from translucent to transparent. Now that may not be evident for those of you that live here in St. Louis, but I grew up in coastal British Columbia, where we had translucent skies for about 325 days of the year, meaning it's permanently overcast. We don't get to see the sun, moon, and stars, except on rare occasions. And before the 4th day, it was permanently overcast. Now, if you're a bacterium or a fungus, it doesn't make any difference. But animals and plants need to have access to the position of the sun, moon, and stars in order to thrive. And that's what you notice in Genesis 1, is that all the life that the Bible describes after the 4th day needs to know where the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky. All the life mentioned previous to the 4th day doesn't need to know that. And what you see in Genesis 1:14, let there be the great lights so that they may serve to mark seasons, days, and years. It's the animals that need to know what season it is in order to reproduce at the right time and feed at the right time of the year. And today we know exactly what it was that was responsible for that transformation. It was the second great oxygenation event. And so this shows you the oxygen content in the Earth's atmosphere. For most of Earth's history, it was 1% or less. And only about 500 million years ago did it jump from 1% up to 8%. And that jump from 1% to 8% meant you could now have animals. Animals can't survive on 1%. They need a minimum of 8%. But what's interesting about the fossil record, the moment it hits 8%, you immediately have animals. There's no time delay. And they show up with a completely optimized ecological relationship between the predators and the carnivores, the parasites and the detrivores. Everything is optimized. immediately with no time delay. This has caught the attention of the leading evolutionary biologists, and they all admit this defies a naturalistic explanation. The fact that as soon as you got the oxygen, you immediately have the animals. No time delay. And creation day 5. Let the waters teem with living creatures. And the world's leading expert on the Cambrian explosion wrote this in a review a few years ago. Quote, elucidating the materialistic basis, that is a godless basis for the Cambrian explosion, has become more elusive, not less, the more we know about the event itself. Even Richard Dawkins has written that these animals come into existence out of nowhere with no evolutionary history. They suddenly appear. And there's more than just one example. We see that for the Cambrian explosion, the Avalon explosion, and at least 6 other mass speciation events in the history of the fossil record. As we move on into creation day 5, we see that it uses the word create for only the second time. In Genesis 1, the word bara, translated create, is reserved when God brings into existence something brand new that never existed before. And it shows up in reference to God creating the birds and the sea mammals. And it says these are animals that are not just physical, they're soulish. This is the first time you have animals endowed with mind, will, and emotions, where they're able to do things through free will expression. These are the animals that will sacrifice to care for their young. These are the animals that have the capacity to form an emotional relationship with human beings. So these are the ones we make pets of. These are the ones we use for agricultural industry. So they're physical, but they're also soulish. And consequently, they're able to relate to and serve and please a higher species, namely us human beings, birds and sea mammals. Then in creation day 6, the text speaks about God creating 3 specialized kinds of land mammals. Now, these are not the first land mammals. Job speaks about that, but not Genesis. These are the 3 categories of land mammals that were most critical for launching human civilization. So they're basically the last of the land mammals that God creates. And the first category described the short-legged land mammals. That's a reference to the rodents. And you say, what do we need rodents for? Well, we really don't need them today for clothing, but they were vital for allowing humanity to move from the tropics into all the habitats of the world. Because we're bipedal, because we're slim, because we don't have hair, and because we got this wonderful perspiration system, we're wonderfully designed for a hot climate, but very poorly designed for a cold climate. But it's thanks to the fact that these rodents love being around human beings, they love being around thousands of their buddies, and because they're very small-bodied creatures, they grow thick, luxuriant fur to keep themselves warm, and early humans were able to use these rodents to develop the clothing that they needed to move into the colder climes. Today, we don't need them for clothing, but we do need them for medical advance. Something that has astounded scientists is how much the DNA of mice and rats is the same as the DNA of us human beings. So, for example, they have the identical brain chemistry pathways that we human beings do. So we're actually able to do medical experiments on mice and rats and develop cures for the brain ailments that we deal with, like Alzheimer's, dyslexia, and other brain disorders. Aren't you glad God made rats and rodents so similar to us in that capacity? And yet the evolutionists would say the creatures that are closest to us in DNA would also be the ones that we're descended from. But I don't think anyone would argue that we're descended from mice and rats. Interestingly, the chimpanzees have very close DNA with respect to the internal organs. And because of that, we can use their organs and put them into human beings. 2 other categories of land mammals. We have those that have long legs, ones that are easy to tame and ones that are difficult to tame, being a reference to those animals that are easy to tame, the herbivores that we use for agricultural industry, and the ones that are difficult to tame, a reference to the carnivores that we use for household pets. And you see this laid out in more detail in the book of Job, how God created some of these mammals to serve us and others to please us. And it's like, we fare better when we have these relationships with these birds and mammals. And I describe this in some detail in this book, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job. And I'm going to speak about this in more detail tomorrow morning in my first message. So I'm not going to say any more about that. But there's also a follow-up in this book, Improbable Planet. And that's my latest science book, Improbable Planet, based on a 5-year project. It began with a year where in our church we went through all the creation texts in the Bible and noted every one of them links the doctrine of creation with the doctrine of redemption. And that began a 3-year survey of the scientific literature. Is it really true that everything that God creates is for the purpose of redemption? The answer is yes. Every event in the history of the universe and the earth, and every component of the universe, the earth, and every life form fulfills a role in making possible the redemption of billions of human beings. I understand that there's someone in your church is actually going to lead a study group to go through Improbable Planet. But I encourage you, go through it with redemption in mind. That's the key. Okay, last of all, God creates human beings. And here again, it uses the word bara to create something brand new. What's distinct about us human beings, we're the only species of life that is spiritual. So there are species that are physical, there are species that are physical and soulish, but only we human beings are physical, soulish, and spiritual. Or to put it another way, God created the birds and mammals to form relationships with a higher species. He created us human beings with a capacity to form a relationship with a higher being. I'll speak about this tomorrow, how Job says, look to the birds, they'll teach you. Look to the beasts of the field, they'll instruct you. What he meant is they'll teach you the spiritual lessons you need to be able to develop a relationship with your Creator. That again will be tomorrow morning's first service's theme. And if you want to read more about Adam and Eve, we put out a book called Who Was Adam? But this is what happened to me at age 17. Recognizing that the word day for the creation days is an epoch of time, and the frame of reference is the surface of the earth, I saw that the Bible got a perfect score in describing the initial conditions and a perfect score in describing the events of creation and a perfect score in putting them in the correct chronological order. I mean, just the probability that Moses could have guessed the correct chronological order without God's help is less than 1 chance in 40 billion. The probability he could have correctly described everything is utterly remote. So seeing that at age 17, I said that my only explanation is that the one that actually did all the creation activity inspired Moses to write this down. And explains why every other creation text I read is filled with scientific errors. Well, that's what motivated me to spend an hour or two every day studying the Bible. It took me 18 months to get to Revelation 22, because what I was doing was checking everything it said about science, history, and geography to see if it was true. And I actually wound up creating a notebook about all the places in the Bible where not only was it scientifically accurate, it was predicting scientific discoveries thousands of years ahead of its time. Because I think you must have noticed that this evening. I'm speaking about what's in Genesis 1 that only scientists in the last century have been able to establish is correct. So for thousands of years, the Bible stood alone in making these statements about the history of Earth's life. And now we can prove everything it said indeed is accurate. Well, by the time I got to Revelation 22, I had found over 200 places in the Bible where it made a prediction of a future scientific discovery thousands of years ahead of its time, and in every single case what it said was accurate. And I calculated the probability that these authors of the Bible could have just guessed all these scientific statements without God's help. The probability was much more remote than 1 chance in 10 to the 300th power. I came up with that number the same time one of my physics professors gave us an assignment to calculate the probability that one of us in our class of 600 would be killed by a sudden reversal of the second law of thermodynamics. You know, that could actually happen right here in this auditorium, because this auditorium is filled with air molecules, but they're not all the same temperature. There's actually a statistical probability that the trillions of air molecules in this room that are below the freezing point of water, 6 seconds from now, will water in the vicinity of this young lady right here and freeze her to death. That could happen. You know what that probability is? 1 chance in 10 to the 80th. Such a tiny possibility that you'd be justified in never worrying about it for the rest of your life. In fact, you'd be justified in concluding it has never happened anytime, anywhere in the entire observable universe. But notice, I just proved that the Bible was 10 to the 220 times more reliable than the second law of thermodynamics. And here I was, 19 years of age now, realizing I trust my life every second to the reliability of the second law of thermodynamics. It would simply be irrational for me to not put even greater confidence in the message of this book we call the Bible. But I want to give credit to the Gideons. In every one of the Gideon Bibles they hand out in public schools, it includes 2 pages that tell you what you need to do once you become convinced that this indeed is the inspired, inerrant word of the one that created the universe. It begins by making the point that God has written the law on the heart of every human being, the conscience, and that none of us can live up to that conscience. And yet God is so loving and so powerful as He's revealed in His creation, He must have made a way. And that way must be by God Himself. And if we put our confidence in God's offer of redemption, He will save us from all of our offenses against God and others. He'll forgive us. The other thing I appreciate about the Gideons, it made the point that God knows us better than we know ourselves. And He is the only one that is perfectly good and pure. So it only makes rational sense to make Him the boss of your life and take direction from Him. The other thing I appreciate about the Gideons, they don't let you off the hook. They got a place right there for you to sign your name and date your name, committing your life to Jesus Christ as Creator, Lord, and Savior. And I did that on August 6th at 1:05 in the morning back in 1964.